Okay. So I can already sense, in myself this. Good. Oh, well done. this tone of conservatism that's, or this danger of conservatism, because whenever we critique these things, this is the advantage again that sort of techno capital has, because it occupies the latest point in history by definition. Any critique of it can seem to be coming from a past, some prelapsarian past. Oh, wasn't it great when we only had rubbishy VHS and kids played in the parks and all, this kind of thing. But this is the problem. This is the problem that we need to be able to critique this from a future which didn't arrive or is yet to come, not from a past which in lots of ways we're glad to see the back of. And this is the kind of task, I think, is to articulate this or bring into existence this other kind of future. And I think this is to do with time, getting time back, because it's kind of paradox about how we think about utopias, I think. In lots of ways, now we can say what is dystopia of now is that we have no time. We're endlessly being chivied, harassed, pushed. We feel that there's too many things for us to do. We don't have time to respond to them. Okay, so we have no time. Yet, one of the ways we think about utopia is as a sort of timeless space, I suppose. But that's but can't we think of utopia as the space where we would have time? In lots of ways. Time which we certainly do not have now. Because what's interesting, isn't it, is about this, we're busy but we're not productive, you could say. Isn't that the essence of late capitalism in there? That the amount of effort that goes into really, as Ivor Southwood, in the title of Ivor Southwood's recent book, an excellent book I would really recommend actually, if you like capitalist realism, and his book Non-Stop Inertia. This captures the quality of life in late capitalism very effectively, I think, that this phrase non-stop inertia. Because if we can say that things have sped up, things are speeding up, but speed implies direction. Actually, that what we've got is a point of speed of digital communication where it's flipped, where things are so fast that they're going nowhere, actually, and that can't even talk about it as fast anymore. This isn't speed if there's no direction to anything. If everything's being held up in this inertial glut at all times, this is no longer a question of speed. Actually, things have massively slowed down. And actually, Simon Reynolds, in the end of his book, Retromania, makes a kind of killer observation, I think, which is that, okay, what has happened recently is the speed of everyday life has gone up, you could say, that that rather than periods of langueur and boredom that would have been the case in a sort of pre-digital communication era, now everyday life is this hyped up, sped up kind of, sped up, as I say, to the point of inertia, kind of phenomenological zone. But culture has slowed down, and I think there's a relation between those two things, actually. Culture we might conjecture, cultural developments, changes require a certain level of stillness, I think, that it's and concentration or attentional focus that is very difficult for us to master now. It's very difficult for us to. How do we enjoy things now, even? Well, even when we're enjoying them, we're not really, because we're probably trying to record them or have got a phone there, so that just make sure that the archive can enjoy it, even if we don't at the time. And the very fact we're recording it means that we know we can't enjoy it. I'm not sure if it was in I forget which book it was in I read recently. Sontag's quote that travelling becomes a way of accumulating photographs. And in the same way, we could say the whole of life becomes a way of accumulating pictures for Facebook, doesn't it? oh, I'll put this on Facebook later. Well, yeah, all right. But why not actually enjoy it? So I think part of what's at stake is how we can avoid conservative moralism here is an argument about enjoyment, actually. That these, rather than delivering enjoyment, we can say that a lot of these digital communicative practices inhibit it. They offer, as it were, pleasure rather than enjoyment, as classic kind of Lacanian or psychoanalytic distinction. In that, because it's too quick, because actually because it provides us with something which gives us an immediate hit. Actually, the hit itself is never that intense. That it's actually the drive. The drive to click is always more intense than what we click on, you can say. I'll tell you this little anecdote, it's absolutely true. A few weeks ago, I was in a situation where it was socially unacceptable for me to check my phone. Okay, so of course, what do? But my hands are twitching, It's twitching, like, I've got to know. Has a message come in? I've got to know. Well, I don't even have to know it. But I put the phone under the table and have the satisfaction of clicking on the phone. I can't even see the phone. I can't see it, but at least I know that it has been checked. It has been checked, even though I haven't checked it myself. And this is the reversal, I think, that Sherry Turkle points up to in her book, Alone Together, where it's not that we're doing our email, it's our email is doing us in lots of ways. That we've become the servo mechanism of the turnover of communicative capitalism. And like I was saying to you yesterday, how important was communication to you 15 years ago? It just wasn't that big a part of your life. You really didn't care about letters that much of stuff. That's whereas now you think we have to know. And as I say, this is surely all done this, something which you're enjoying more, which may, often for me, I'll be enjoying writing, I'll be enjoying reading, but I still feel that pull to interrupt that enjoyment by the duty, the kind of duty stroke pleasure of checking my messages or my email, which of course is always a crushing disappointment, no matter what they are. Because nothing's ever enough, and you want to click again almost immediately. Actually, probably one of the best messages I ever got was the one from Martin, recently, because it's a nice fee, and it's nice to come over here or whatever. But it doesn't get better than that. And if I'd have waited a few hours, the offer would still probably been there. But I think Morley describes an advance of actually happening, this cruising through the I-time, or I space-time, my space-time, and a kind of the forms of pleasure that are available there, but also the desolation of that pleasure, I think. A desolation which comes out very powerfully in, well, that's less dramatic than it should have been, in this. Do you recognise it? Yeah, it's the this to me is the ruination of Paul Morley's city. This is an Inception. Inception, which is for me a major symptomatic film, I think, of recent times. Why? Well, this is a film surrealism, or rather the unconscious without surrealism. Frederick Jameson talks about postmodernism as surrealism without the unconscious. Now we have this further phase of the unconscious without surrealism. The most depressing, surely, the scenes of limbo in Inception, and the love scenes, the most depressing scenes in cinema history, right? Oh, this wonderful, it's like a love scene as PowerPoint, isn't it? Oh look, here's the house where we first lived. Let's put it next to some other houses where we lived. The utter miserable existential desolation of those empty arcades where they walk together. It's 50 years down there. No wonder you went mad. it's as if what was interesting about Inception, fascinating about it, in fact, for me, is the sense that however deep you go, it's still a non-space. Okay, so you start off in hotels, homogeneous hotels. You know, you go down a level. You're in sort of like anonymous streets, which could be any city in the world. You know, you go down further. We're into this kind of empty retail plaza. That's what's image. That's the best they can come up with as an image of of happiness now. You know, this utterly depressing. I think that. But it seems to me that part of at stake in this imagery of Inception and why it is symptomatic. It is like the dilapidated form of the iTunes or iPod city. Actually, that's what we're looking at here. An unconscious which has been superseded, replaced, displaced by this connected consumer non-spatiality or non-space-time, falling into decay and dilapidation. I think in lots of ways we can see that the early part of the 21st century is bookended by two of Nolan's films, by Inception at the end and by Memento at the beginning. Because what is at stake here? Problems of memory, I think. Problems of memory are kind of crucial. Well, I'll come back to that shortly when I talk about the caretaker. But I think part of the reason that there's this debate that's deliberately cultivated by Nolan, who is a master of generating communicative capitalism around his films, right? Like a master of getting people like me to add to the hype of his films by discussing them, But that he is, the key debate about it, which sort of ontologically is pretty banal. Like, oh, is it a dream or not? The oldest, hokiest kind of, ontological gambit you can have in fiction, really. But okay, why has this got a particular force at this time? It's because of that sense that the inescapability of the non-place. I think wherever we are in the film, it has that prefabricated homogeneity about it. Everything feels as if it is a genre construct, including, of course, Dom Cobb's grief itself, which feels just as unconvincing as any of the other things at the apparently embedded level of the fictions. There's a deep sadness in Inception. Inception is a mordant film, but that sadness is never at the level of the film itself. It's like what is the film about? It's like as if the unconscious itself, as I say, has been removed. There's been this excision, this operation, this traumatic operation of the removal of the unconscious, and then it's as if we and the characters in Inception are circulating in this space where we've lost something very profound, but we don't know what it is, and we just have to keep struggling round and round endlessly in these charmless spaces, looking for the thing which we've lost and which we can never find anymore. That's the deep sadness of Inception, I think. And also, I think in terms of the non-space time thing, when is Inception set? If you look at the technology, it's very low tech, right? You don't see it. I don't think you really see a computer in it. It's very interesting. I think that's why it's a parable of the digital, because there's no digital in it. It's a world entirely inside the digital, but that doesn't represent the digital as such, I think. Okay, now back to hauntology. This is a different sense of time crisis here. This is a still from a BBC television play, which is an adaptation of the short story by M.R. James, the British horror writer. Well, I say horror. Its stories belong to a very sort of specific genre on the edge of the weird, really. This is from a story called "Oh Whistle, I'll Come to You." "Oh whistle and I'll come to you, my lad," which is a quote from a poem, I think. I forget who the poet is, but this was made in 1968 by Jonathan Miller, who had recently made probably one of the best adaptations of Alice in Wonderland, sort of a year or so before that. So what happens in "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You" is this antiquarian scholar, probably closely based on James himself, who was an Oxford antiquarian himself, travels up to the east coast of England, where I live now, and in fact to the town where I live now, the very town where the container ports are at the moment, and he discovers this ancient whistle. He digs it up in the ground, this ancient whistle. He's a sort of bluff, logical positivist type person, dismisses the belief in the supernatural, etc. We all know what happens to people in films, etc. Or stories who dismiss belief in the supernatural. Of course, he blows the whistle, and then he is afflicted by these traumatic events, which seem to be of a supernatural origin. What's interesting about this in this context for me is that we get a sense here of the not anthropological place or the non-place of Auger, but of a hauntological place, where a particular place is stained with time in a particular way. I mean, what is haunt? The verb haunt in English carries this double sense, I think, of both of spectrality and of a particular place. You can use the phrase "my old haunts," meaning places that I used to go to. Here we come to one of the key phrases in Derrida's conception of hauntology, as outlined in Spectres of Marx, which is the phrase which he takes from Hamlet: "The time is out of joint." Time is broken, it can't be made to fit together again. But hauntological time is different to the non-time that I've been pointing to. The non-time is characterized by a kind of flattening out. Ontological time, I think, is more characterized by trauma, by a wound and an absence. And that's why I think something like Inception is on the boundaries of the two, actually. But beyond the non-time is an unspoken hauntology, actually, a wound, a trauma, which it can't face, and which the loss of his wife in the film codes for this other trauma, which we don't see, and which the whole of the film depends upon this absence, I think. Hauntology, particularly as it's come to the fore in the last few years in relation to music, is about mourning. Of course, in Derrida's writing Spectres of Marx fairly soon after the Berlin Wall came down, and he's engaging with something which we talked about yesterday, Francis Fukuyama's thesis that we've reached the end of history, that everything has come to an end. For Fukuyama, in an ambivalently good way. I say ambivalently good because Fukuyama thinks, like Hegel, that history has a direction and a point of termination. And for Fukuyama, unlike for Marx, this will be the end of history is liberal democracy and capitalism. But I say ambivalent. Fukuyama is ambivalent about it because the title of his book is The End of History and The Last Man. The Last Man, a concept from Nietzsche. The Last Man is, in a way, the obverse figure to the Superman, the Übermensch. That, so whilst the Superman, the Overman can affirm the contingency of being, can affirm the meaninglessness of life and impose its own meaning on it, the Last Man is unable to do that. The Last Man, for Nietzsche, engages in what he calls cosmopolitan fingering. Fantastic phrase. What does that mean? Well, it means that all of history is available for the Last Man to look at and sort of finger and push and put down again. Whilst for the Overman, the Übermensch, the disintegration of all previous beliefs is the precondition for this new kind of this production of belief and value coming from the Übermensch himself, and it usually is, and for Nietzsche, of course, it is a man. The Last Man can't believe in that anymore. Some of Nietzsche's earliest work, and some of his best work really, is about the dangers of history. He argues that actually the great civilizations of the world were those which were productively ignorant. That like the Greeks or the Romans had very little sense of what had come before them, and it's not that they couldn't find out; they just didn't care either, because they thought they were at the center of things. Whereas Nietzsche thinks that Germany of the 19th century was increasingly hidebound by history. History, if you know too much history, it produces nihilism. That's the claim of Nietzsche. Why? Because you become too aware of things. You become like a depressive. You just think, oh look, yeah, there was a great civilization there, did great stuff. Look, there's pyramids and all that. Yeah, that fell into decadence and collapse. There's the mighty Roman Empire. Yeah, collapsed eventually, lasted a few hundred years, maybe. Nothing lasts forever. What's the point? Let's put another DVD on. This is what Nietzsche, I think, very acutely grasps our subjectivity in lots of ways, or our subjectivity into the subjectivity of late capitalism. I think he grasps it very early on what that will be like. When belief is stripped away and we kind of have multi-channel access to everything. So that we're in this spectatorial mode, we have this kind of ironic detachment from things because we're too aware. We're too aware to actually commit ourselves to a belief in anything. We step back. That's another dimension of this atemporality. We are not in ourselves in history. We look back upon history as a series of entertainments for ourselves. Entertainments which sort of reassure us that there's really no point getting up off the sofa. Everything collapses in the end. And this figure of the Last Man then, of the individual who can no longer believe, who's kind of bored, resigned, and cynical, is what haunts Fukuyama's achieved utopia, utopia end of history. That's why he thought that the dangers to capitalist, the inevitable capitalist terminal beach of history would not come from Marxism, he thought, but from the Nietzschean direction. He thought that capitalism, why is capitalism at the end of history, as it were? Because it's almost the same argument as Deleuze and Guattari, but in a different direction. Because capitalism depends upon this radical decoding of all previous belief systems, because capitalism, that is to say, is inherently desacralizing. So it replaces religious fervor with this kind of last man disenchantment. And the thing about last man, since they don't really believe in anything that fervently, they're not, to use Alberto Toscano's word, fanatics. I think Alberto discusses Fukuyama's book in his book, Reasoned Book Fanaticism, for good reason. That because then, the last man is by definition not a fanatic. He's the opposite of a fanatic. He's someone who, in some ways, looks jealously upon fanatics, because they can believe, they have the possibility for belief where he doesn't have that possibility. He knows too much, or he thinks he knows too much. As Nietzsche says, that this is the danger of knowledge in lots of ways. Once you have it, you can't get rid of it. And this is what Fukuyama thought, that this level of disaffection, discontent, and not being satisfied with this kind of existential aloofness, that was where the danger to capitalism would come from. Okay, but Derrida was engaging with this question of the end of history, the triumph of capitalism, and this notion of the death of communism, which he talks about. But one of the questions he poses is, well, can we really say that communism had arrived? Would we really want to make that claim that the Soviet system was communism? Well, almost nobody would really think that was an achieved communism. So we're talking about the death of something which had not actually happened yet, which is strange. And so what rather than mourning the disappearance of what was then actually existing socialism, what Derrida opens up to us is the possibility of mourning for the future which didn't arrive. The communist horizon itself, you could say, to use the title of a forthcoming book by Jody Dean.
Should we take
okay, yes, a good point to take a break, actually. Yeah.
Excellent. So, cigarette, tea, and then
I know someone switched their thing down. Is it that one? How do I get the sound back up?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to start again with another piece of music to set the tone. That's a track called Emptiness, which is by the artist James Kirby, going under the name of The Caretaker. The Caretaker is basically a conceptual project, I think, by Kirby, which started up from a simple conceit, which was, what if you produced a whole album's worth of material, such as you might have heard in the Overlook Hotel in The Shining? Okay, so in The Shining, Kubrick's film from 1979, 80, I think it's probably made and finished in 79, released in 80, I think. You know, we hear some music. Some of the most powerful scenes in the film are feature music. They in fact feature the pre-war South African crooner Al Bowley, who came to fame in the Lyceum Ballroom, particularly in London, and whose songs are also featured in the television plays of famously of Dennis Potter, the Singing Detective, and Pennies from Heaven. And so Kirby's idea was, okay, that stuff is kind of compellingly spectral. Why don't we just produce a whole album of stuff like that? So what he got was lots of pop music from the 30s and 40s and subjected it to various processes of kind of artificial decay, you might say. I mean, in addition to the actual decay, which is also undergone, and it was come off vinyl records, then you know, subject to massive levels of reverb or echo, etc. And okay, so from something which seems in a way a semi-humorous conceit, I think Kirby's intervention becomes a kind of major work of kind of sonic art diagnostics, actually. That you know, if Kirby had done this under the aegis of sound art rather than of music, he'd probably be a lot better known and a lot wealthier than he is today. And if only much sound art was as interesting as the Caretaker project turned out to be. I think it's a major work, becomes a major work of diagnostics. Okay, so it starts off as this work of kind of veiling and nostalgia, and you could say that veiling is inherent to nostalgia. That you know, that the passage of time, the ellipses in memory that such a passage inevitably produces, is the precondition for nostalgia. Things which were in the background of our attention at the time suddenly come to the foreground. They are often the things which will trigger this reversion into the past. And this ache, the jouissance of nostalgia, which is to do with an enjoyment of ache, an enjoyment of pain, algia, pain. And nostos, which originally was to do with place, not time, actually. So again, we've got this notion of place-time being tied up.
Home, actually.
Yes, home. Yeah, home, which is even more ambivalent about in respect of time and place. Because home, I think, also connotes a time as well as a place. So it starts off as a kind of interrogation, investigation of nostalgia, and one of the material traces of this is the sound of vinyl crackle itself. Vinyl crackle itself becomes a feature of lots of the music that got classified as hauntological in the last decade. And interestingly, the musicians who started to foreground this vinyl crackle didn't influence each other. Okay, so we had this James Kirby project. We had Burial, who I played yesterday, I'll play again today, shortly. We have people like William Basinski, whose work, the Disintegration Loops, is really incredible work of symptom and diagnosis. If you don't know this work, it's Basinski was transferring off old analog tapes onto digital, his tape experiments that he made in the early 80s. What happened when he tried to transfer some of them is that the tape actually disintegrated in the act of the transfer. And so what you can hear on the disintegration loops is the literal disintegration of the analog medium. You know, a major moment, I think, of you know, what we can hear is that, you know, this shift into a medium where there is apparently no loss. Of course, there is loss in digital, but with this promise of complete capture and replicability. The shift into digital, when we lose nothing or seem to lose nothing. In fact, we did lose a lot, especially if we listen on MP3s. I mean, you know, what we lose is exactly the dimension of the unheard but the felt, and in particular, you know, sub bass, and the whole dimension of sub sound, which you would definitely feel if you go out to a club to hear music played in a collective environment. And that's a lot of the appeal of dubstep, I think, as in many ways a very limited form of music, but has an appeal because if you go there, the physical force of the sub bass, the enveloping quality of the sub bass, is something which you simply can have no equivalent of listening on headphones at all, because it's a whole body experience, not something just confined to the ears. But come back to this question of the shift from analog to digital, so that with the promise of infinite replicability. I mean, with digital, we're no longer in the realm of the copy at all. There's no such thing as a digital copy, really, because what is a digital file is a series of ones and zeros, and each iteration of that file is the same. You know, it's the same series of ones and zeros. It's not a copy. With analog copies, there's always the question of degradation. In a way, you could argue that degradation is the mark of a copy, actually, in a way. And with digital, we have replication or propagation without copies, actually. I can't really call it copies anymore. But so a number of these artists, as I say, come together by confluence, not influence. And we start to hear in their work the emergence of this vinyl crackle. What does the vinyl crackle signify? Or what it more than signifies, it expresses this time out of joint. Well, because we no longer have the illusion of presence when we're confronted with this sound, because we know that what we're hearing is the mediation, the material mediation, which allows us to hear it, is being foregrounded here. And in some ways, the sound of crackle is a bit like soft focus in film. It signifies another time, a time beyond the present in which we're actually listening. And of course, there's no accident that this is related to The Shining. The Shining, which is in Stephen King's novel, which I think is one of the best horror novels, really, of the 20th century, actually. That King sort of outdoes himself with The Shining and can really never repeat what he achieved with The Shining ever again, I think. At King's novel, he says, the corridors of the Overlook Hotel extend in time as well as space. And this is the Overlook Hotel really is, as filmed by Kubrick, is on the cusp between a non-place and a hauntological place, you could say. When we first see Jack Torrance enter into the hotel, he's interviewed by this typical kind of Kubrick non-person, you know, the manager of the hotel. And it's this kind of interface between the way hotels are now, transnational hotels, the way they're managed, the anonymous homogeneity of hotels, and this sense of specificity about the Overlook Hotel. With its, what is the Overlook Hotel? Was Frederick Jameson argues in his essay on The Shining, which you can find online, Historicism in The Shining. It's very good. What is the Overlook Hotel? It's in lots of ways it's American history itself. American history itself, which is based on an erasure. Because in the film, not in the book, the hotel is famously on an Indian burial ground, like the whole of American history itself, you could say, built on an Indian burial ground. And okay, so I think The Shining is a very significant film because of the moment that it emerged. Yesterday, as I was saying, a shift from social democracy to neoliberalism, from Fordism to post-Fordism happens at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. It's precisely the point when The Shining comes out. And Jack Torrance in The Shining is like the last man in many ways. He stumbles through history, dressed in his lumber jacket, and his jeans. This is a man who's enticed and drawn back into the fantasies of opulence particularly of the 20s and 30s. But he's also a man who is out of time, who doesn't belong anywhere. Which is to say that he only belongs in the Overlook Hotel. And this scene, one of the most powerful scenes in the film, where Jack confronts Delbert Grady, the butler, who at some level he knows also has, in the recent past of the hotel, killed his own children. Yet Grady now appears to be a butler in what seems to be the 20s or the 30s. And this, in playing in the background as this is going on, is Al Bowley's track, It's All Forgotten Now. And Kubrick's musical placement of music in films is always extremely thought about. It's All Forgotten Now, with this, a hauntological anthem in many ways. As this is playing, then Delbert Grady says to Jack, you are the caretaker, you've always been the caretaker. Part of the horror of The Shining is this sense of fatality, that Jack, like Oedipus, was always destined for a horrible fate, which he was never going to be able to escape. And in a way, this is the horror of patriarchy itself, where the father is always in the role of the caretaker. The father, what is the caretaker? Is someone who takes on the job for the management that you never see in a film. And there's a point earlier on where Jack confronts the barman. The barman, incidentally, is played by the same person who plays Tyrell in Blade Runner. Surely two of the biggest bit parts in the history of cinema, actually. I've never seen him in anything else, that guy. In that earlier scene, Jack says, the barman says, okay, your money's worth nothing here, Jack. Mr. Torrance, actually. And he says, I like to know who's paying for my drinks, but he never finds out. You never see who the management is, the management of the Overlook Hotel. The management is some hideous amalgam of patriarchy and capitalism itself, which requires its fathers to be homicidal, to kill their own children. And of course, for Freud in Moses and Monotheism, this is the fundamental task of the father, is not to actually kill the child, but to mortify the child. That what happens in Moses and Monotheism is that, according to Freud, there's a traumatic. The founding event of human history itself, of civilization, is when a band of the band of kind of subordinate proto-apes, or sort of proto-human apes, gang up together and kill the alpha male, the alpha male sort of father of the society. They kill that father, and why? Because the father has, is dominating them and has exclusive control over the females, exclusive access to the females, and so the brothers think, well, okay, if we kill the father, we will have the access to enjoyment that the father now has. But of course, it doesn't work out like that. When the sons rebel, kill the father, and eat him, according to Freud, what happens is that instead of now achieving this access to total enjoyment. Instead, they're overcome by feelings of melancholy, remorse. And rather than having got rid of the father, from being a contingent physical being, becomes an infinite presence as a spectre. Now, the internalized voice of the father is unanswerable and makes demands which are infinite. And of course, Freud's point partly being that the role of the father, in his own day, particularly, the role of the father was always a fantasy role and a symbolic role, because people you couldn't confirm who the father was. There was no pre-genetics. There was no way of absolutely proving who the father was. I mean, you could with blood tests you could disprove who certain fathers were, but you couldn't absolutely prove it. So Freud's point being that of course the father, even if you happen to be the biological father, actually your role as father was always a symbolic role. And I think that The Shining is about this hauntological dimension of fatherhood, I think, partly. And what it is to be the caretaker, to be in this role of passing on mortification, as it were. Where you are not in charge yourself, you're never in charge, you are simply, as it were, in lieu of something else, a tenant who is merely passing through. Oh, sorry, wrong way. Okay, I'm going to play you another track now. Okay, that's also a track by the caretaker. But this is from his 6 CD set, Theoretically Pure Anterograde Amnesia, which came out, I think, sort of around about 2005-06 time. Okay, so we can hear there the development of the project, what theoretically pure anterograde amnesia is the thing that Lenny suffers from in Memento, which is the complete opposite of what we ordinarily think about amnesia, i.e. the whole past is wiped out. As we remember from Lenny, what Lenny suffers from is that he can remember his past up to a certain point. What he cannot do is make new memories. He can't hold any new memories, so he's locked in this perpetual present with only which is disconnected from a past. Back in time. And what the caretaker tried to do on this 6 CD set is simulate this condition. So as you can see, that whilst in the first track you can still hear the song, albeit buried beneath this beneath the levels of distortion, echo, and reverb. On theoretically pure anterograde amnesia, it's the reverse. So what you can hear is the distortion and the echo and the reverb, but you've got very little sense of the original tracks. There's about 60 tracks. All of them are numbered, and what it does when you listen to it does simulate the condition in you as a listener, and that you can't remember what you've heard. There's not enough, sort of as it were, sonic landmarks for you to remember if this is a track you've heard before or not. You get these occasional flarings of recognition where you think there's a trace of a song that you've heard before, but you can't be sure about it. So it's as if we ourselves, and we're listening, are suffering from this condition. But I think that it's not as if we're suffering from that condition. In lots of ways we are suffering from that condition. And this is what I mean by the caretaker's work of diagnosis, that in lots of ways, rather than suffering from nostalgia, what we suffer from is theoretically pure anterograde amnesia. In a sense that there's a cultural history which is intact, going up to whatever time, the year 2000. And after that point, we can't make new memories, so we rely on the old forms in order to navigate round in an environment which is kind of forbiddingly lacking in any temporal markers, you can say. And in a way, this is a way of restating the problem that Frederick Jameson had broached in his work on postmodernism when he argued that there's a crisis of the present that he started to see in the 80s. Modernism had been about trying to grasp the present. They realised that you couldn't grasp the present in terms of 19th century realism, that you need some kind of cubistic strategy in order to represent the unrepresentable in lots of ways. Jameson arguing that things have been aggravated since the grand period of modernism. That with the introduction of, if modernism is about the city in lots of ways, and early forms of mass media such as film and newspapers, then by the time that Jameson's writing with video, the emergence of video, MTV, which everyone used to think about as the classic exemplar of a new kind of culture at that time. Then the issue is more about a kind of media time, than it is about a kind of urban time. But of course, 20 years after Jameson's writing, things have become accelerated, as they said, to the point of inertia. And the space of communicative capitalism, as I've tried to indicate earlier on, makes our ability to navigate ourselves, to locate ourselves in time, much more difficult than it ever was previously. So I think this is an interesting way of thinking about things. Rather than thinking about nostalgia, thinking about memory disorders. That what we're confronted with is stuff that, although it's old, we don't think of it as old anymore. It's contemporary to us, like demented people. If we confront people who are demented, they'll often think that they're still living in 1964 or whatever. In a way, we still are living in 1980, but we think we're not, in some ways, culturally speaking. It's like a form of widespread dementia, which we take for granted, actually. I've juxtaposed playing that caretaker track with the title of the recent album by Echoplex, an artist based in Bristol, called Memorex, a brilliant title. Memorex, was a cassette manufacturer. As Momorex. But of course, by spelling it like this, he forms a kind of conceptual pun based on the wreckage of memory, the destruction of memory, together with this notion of something which preserved memory, which was the cassette form, and actually got issued on 2 cassettes, the Echoplex records. So I think this is another way of getting to the digital pathologies that we're encountering. If we don't have a sense of the present, then that is also a problem of memory. It's a problem of narrative. That if we don't know what the present is, then we can't distinguish a memory from what is actually we were actually experiencing at the time. And I think, again, I think that's why part of the significance of something like Inception, which is it's a non-space and a non-time, a non-place, but a non-place built out of memories. Remember, a lot of Inception. Yeah.
Like if we want to make to give ourselves a feeling of like now is a time that is special and we don't involve all the other times, then don't we have to kind of put away all the other cultures and memories? Like I understand it happened in post-colonialism that they start preserving all the other cultures in parallel to theirs. So all of them exist at the same time. And we don't want to go back to only one thing that we know where we are.
No, we don't want to go back to anything, I would say. We don't want to go back to anything, but this is the situation. We're not happy with where we are, and I think at lots of levels we're multiply unhappy, and we're more unhappy than we think we are. And I think we'll only realise how unhappy we are now when we're not in this state anymore. And because that's what, it's cultural depression. We're all depressed to one degree or another. We don't think anything's going to happen again. That's pretty bad. We sort of, but it's okay, it's like, this analogy of a frog being boiled, isn't it? That if you turn the heat up gradually, it doesn't really notice and it won't jump out of the water. And, that's what we're not being boiled to death. We're being sort of boiled at the point of stupefaction, where brains are sort of heated up, but we just can't really. It makes us too sluggish to get out of the situation that we're in. Really, we definitely don't want to go back to anything, but the problem is that all these discourses of postmodern multiplicity that post-colonialism has played a part of, really, just form this last man dilettantism, don't they? So instead of, you get this bad opposition between, old monolithic modernist culture, now pluralistic, diverse, anything goes, but neither of these things are particularly desirable, really. Surely it's the opposition itself that is the problem. And so the question is, how do we move out of the old, which certainly there was dimensions of that old culture, some social, whatever you call it, social democratic, modernistic, paternalistic culture that was restrictive and repressive. But the thing is to go back to when we were in it and think about how we could have come out of it differently than we did. Because when we wanted to come out of that, we didn't want to go into a shopping mall. And we didn't want the whole of the cosmos to become a shopping mall and a kind of, buy on demand, online sort of video arcade. That's not what we wanted, I think. So the question was, how could things have turned out differently? And that is the question for me. And which is to retain the critique of those, critique coming out of post-colonialism, coming out of feminism, coming out of everything else which attacked the privileged and restricted nature of modernist, Fordist culture, or whatever, is to retain all of that, but not end up in where we were, because those discourses form this weird synergy with late capitalism, which is not. And you can't make the mistake of, like, I think that Zizek makes, where to say, okay, they're the same as late capitalism. They form an alibi for late capitalism in the current conjuncture, for sure. But that isn't, the point is that they don't have to, and that how do we maintain those and maintain a desire for a culture that isn't that isn't an I culture? This for me is the central problem here. So I wouldn't want to go back to anything. Wouldn't want to go back to anything. And the lure or the danger of any of this stuff is the pull of is the pull of a fake nostalgia. Well, all nostalgia is fake. That's the point, because nostalgia is not about going back to how things were. It's about the allure of things when you have distance from them, the ache and pain of which is produced by the distance. It's a classic kind of Lacanian jouissance nostalgia, I think. Okay.